it's very difficult to come up with an estimate. I mean, I've tried various things. So, I mean, the general way to count a flock of birds that's just too numerous to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is to count a patch of, you count 10 birds, and then you sort of think of, like, if you created a rubber stamp with those 10 birds and kind of rubber stamp that and go, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, that's 10 patches of about 10. That's about 100. And then you repeat that at a bigger scale. You say, okay, so if that's about 100 birds in that flock, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's about you kind of get an idea of how much space maybe 1,000 birds take up, and you rubber stamp that across the sky, which would be fine if they were all sitting in one place, but they're swirling around, and the density isn't uniform. There might be thicker over here and thinner over here, and then a bunch of them land and new ones come in, and then something scares them, and they, the ones that were in the trees go swooping up again. So, did I count these already? And so it's really at best a wild guess. You can probably accurately guess how many zeros there should be, but as far as what that number at the beginning of it should be is a little difficult. Another technique I've heard is, and I'm a bit skeptical of, I mean, we've had some people from the Purple Martin Conservation Association come down, and I think they've given us some estimates of maybe 100 to 200,000 birds. There was one Audubon member who had this idea of, like, the martins will come into these roosts from all directions. They tend to go out of the city in the morning, and they feed in these. They feed in the agricultural areas, which tend to have more insects than in the city, and then they come back in the evening, and they'll sort of come in. If you think of the directional compass as kind of a clock, you might say, okay, so between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock, that 1/12 of the sky. If you can count the martins, if you can accurately count the martins coming in from that direction by maybe going a few miles out from the roost, and count all the martins you can see passing over, because when they're heading to the roost, they're not doing so much swirling. They're generally going one direction, so you can count them once and be done. So if you could think, well, if I can count all the martins coming from this 1/12 and multiply that by 12, assuming they're coming from the same number in all directions, maybe that gives me an estimate. And he observed in one spot and used that to come up with an estimate of 600,000 birds, which I think sounds a bit much. And it's possible that maybe he was looking at a very dense area, and maybe the other wedges of this clock were not quite so dense, and so maybe multiplying his wedge by 12. I'm not exactly sure what his technique was, if I'm describing it accurately, but it was that basic idea. I think he came up with a bit of an overestimate, but anyway. Another thing that people have used sometimes is taking photos and counting after the fact. Okay, I'm going to take this photo and, take a red pen and mark each of them. That way I know how many birds, but you can't take a 360 fisheye view at the level of detail that would allow you to snapshot all the martins at one time. So that's also just a way of getting an estimate of one chunk of sky, and then you have to sort of multiply that out. And then it's an interesting thing that you see when you can only really appreciate it when you go to one of these roosts. I mean, you can see what any observer would just say, that has to be tens of thousands of birds just swirling in the sky, and there's multiple layers. Like, if you can see what you can see with the naked eye, and you put your binoculars up and you realize that there are birds higher up that you can't even see with the naked eye, and they're also thick up there. But all these birds end up in about 7 trees, 7 live oak trees, among probably a few dozen trees at this. Well, they've hopped around between several different parking lots lined with oak trees over the years, but they really try to pack into as small space as possible. You would think it might be possible to count, once they've landed and they're not moving around, to count them on the trees. And maybe you could, if you could somehow get above them, but they're so dense. I mean, they're covering almost every surface of it, and there's several layers of them. So I think even that approach would be difficult to count them. But I think they have characteristics like a school of fish. If one's ever seen a documentary with this twisting school of fish, and the dolphin comes in from the right, and the whole school sort of separates around it. I think what they're trying to do in clustering into so few trees is nobody wants to be the edge bird in case a falcon comes by or a red-tailed hawk. Everyone wants to be in the middle so that if danger comes in the night, that they're going to grab whoever's on the outside of the pack, the group, the flock. It makes me wonder, I think I had this thought once or twice before, but I don't know if there's any way of weighing a tree, of somehow getting some kind of a scale like underneath, like, because that would be an accurate, I mean, can figure out how much a marten weighs. So if you could actually get something under a tree that could sense the amount of weight that gets added to a tree, you might be able to say, okay, we've got 3,000 pounds of marten. Each marten weighs a half an ounce, so therefore this is 250,000 martens. But I don't know how you get a scale underneath a tree. You might have to plant an acorn on a scale and wait 30 years, but but then you have to convince the martens to use that tree.